So, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're located, where you're joining us from. I'm Alan Ewing, CBRS Alliance Executive Director. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for a joint CBRS Alliance ATIS webinar on shared HNI for private networks. So, over the next hour, our presenters will provide an overview of the shared network, shared HNI assigned for users of the CBRS spectrum. Our two presenters today are going to be Gary Rickenacher, the Principal Solutions Architect of iConnective, representing ATIS, and Al Jetta, Head of CBRS Standards at Nokia and Technical Working Group Chair at CBRS Alliance. So Gary, I will turn it over to you and ask you to get us started, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so if you go to the first slide, just as a means of introduction, my current title is Principal Solutions Architect, but I've been around the industry, the telecommunications industry, for a little over 40 years now. And during my time in the industry, I have chaired, and we'll talk about acronyms and titles, but the IOC, the IMSI Oversight Council, I was chair of that group for 8 years, from 2000 to 2008. In addition, I was the chair at the ITU with a numbering question, which has responsibility for not only E164, which are telephone numbers, but E.212, which we're kind of focused on today. That's an identification plan. So I was the chair of that group for 12 years, from 2000 to 2012. So just for some background. Okay, so if you want to go to the first slide. Okay, so one of the things, the acronym I gave you in my introduction is the IOC, which is the ATIS IMSI Oversight Council. And before I get into that, I'm just going to provide, a little bit of background about the industry and kind of roles and responsibilities. So like I mentioned, the IOC works in conjunction with the IMSI administrator. Now, the IMSI administrator happens to be part of the company I'm with, and that's iConnective, and we work hand in hand with ATIS on the management and oversight. And as part of the role, we oversee the assignment in the U.S. of there's another acronym called an IMSI, which is the entire 15 digits of the International Mobile Subscriber Identity. And part of the IOC's mandate is to oversee the assignment guidelines for these resources. Now, like most other resources, it's a finite resource. There's only so many of them. So there is criteria and there is an assignment process in order to apply for and get assignments. But fundamentally, IMSIs are used within mobile phones and mobile networks for operators to identify the mobile subscriptions, like the mobile terminals and subscriptions, to make sure that the calls are authenticated, they're identified to the network, but also then to allow that subscriber to get service. Now, in terms of the broader context, the Department of State is the responsible organization for the oversight of these E212 resources, because the Department of State is the U.S. representative to the ITU. Now, the ITU is a treaty organization which almost every country in the world belongs to. And from the ITU has developed a plan called E212, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But the allocation of mobile country codes goes to each member state or national country. So just like any other country, the United States gets allocated these mobile country codes by the ITU. And the U.S. Department of State is then responsible for the national part of that. And the national part of that is actually the next couple digits after the MCC, called the MNC. So they're responsible for the U.S. management and allocation. Now, through this process, iConnective is the administrator, and we actually administer and assign the codes, and ATIS is responsible for maintaining the industry oversight, the IMSI Oversight Council. So that's kind of the situation regarding roles and responsibility and who does what. So one of the other terms that we're going to throw at you now is something called a Home Network Identity. And the Home Network Identity also, there's other terminology for this, commonly referred to as PLMID, is the first 6 digits of the IMSI. And that really contains two components, the MCC and the MNC. So again, the ATIS IOC oversees that allocation in the U.S. Now, the HNI is required for deployment and identification of services and connectivity, and it's really used for routing purposes as well. But the set of guidelines when E212 was developed was really to adhere and conform to the exclusive use of licensed spectrum and public networks. And if you think about it, when E212 was developed over 25 years ago, one of the main responsibilities was really roaming. Now, so that means that if a person in the United States, if I went from the East Coast to the West Coast, but I was roaming on a different network and I tried to initiate a phone call, the E212 relay identification plan would go to the visited network. The visited network would see, based on the IMSI, what network my subscription belonged to. And if they had roaming agreements, then it would then the call would go through, it would be established, and there's billing and collections, established around that. Same is true internationally. So if I travel from the United States to another country, I'm in a visited network. And so if I go to the UK and I'm on a Vodafone network and I have a subscription for one of the US providers, the Vodafone network would recognize me, and they probably have an interconnect agreement with one of the major US providers, and therefore my call could be established. So this identification plan has uses really around the globe, and it is consistent across countries. And one of the other things to mention is the HNI itself has the capacity, the capability for 1 billion IMSIs, which are a lot. But if you go to the next slide is really the components and shows the components of the IMSI. Now, I had mentioned ITU recommendation E.212 for its purpose and scope. And really, like I think I mentioned, it's really for unique international identification of mobile networks for the terminals and the users. And this enables them to really roam amongst public networks all around the world. So, and I think I've stated IMSIs are required so that if you're in a visited network, that visited network can identify you as a subscriber or customer, and if you have an interconnect agreement, then to the home network, then the call will be established. So very briefly, the components and the structure of E212, if you look on the bottom, the left, the first component is MCC, which stands for Mobile Country Code, and that's 3 digits. And the ITU established these codes and actually allocated them to member states. So when the U.S. got a set of mobile country codes for them to assign nationally, and it's always a national matter how to assign the next component, which is the MNC, or the mobile network code, which is 2 or 3 digits. So I'll allude to the IOC again. That's an industry committee, the IMSI Oversight Council. When they did the assignment guidelines for the HNIs, it includes the mobile country codes. But what iConnective really administers is the MCC, which is allocated by the ITU, but more importantly, the MNC, which is the national component. In addition to those two components, there is something called an MSIN, and that component is the Mobile Subscriber Identification Number. So that's allocated to individual users with a subscription. So the MCC MNC, or the HNI or PLMID, identifies the network to which you belong, and the IMSI actually is identification to the network of the subscriber within that. And the responsibility for the allocation, assignment, maintenance of the MSIN is at the sole discretion of the assignee, or the operator that was assigned the HNI. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so kind of focus in on what this webinar is about. Some time ago, at the end of last year, the CBRS service, or the Alliance, came to the IOC to request a numbering resource. And out of E212. And the reason they did that is that part of CBRS is in a shared spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz innovation band that utilizes LTE. And so for CBRS to be a commercially viable type service, they required an HNI to distinguish their service from other services. So the CBRS Alliance initiated discussions with the ATIS IMSI Oversight Council and the IMSI Administrator on the allocation of HNIs for this new band that became available. And through discussions, it was determined that the IOC determined that the CBRS Alliance did not qualify for an HNI under the pre-existing guidelines. And if you remember, the pre-existing guidelines were basically for public networks and for roaming so that they could roam, but the CBRS use cases and criteria were different. But to the industry's benefit, they recognized the criticality of enabling, this innovation technology and defining ways to ensure or enable CBRS operators to at least apply for and be assigned these HNIs or IMSIs out of E212. But one of the other things to consider was one of the criteria that came to us from the CBRS Alliance is that potentially there could be thousands of applicants. So one of the things that the IOC recognized was that this HNI pool, the MCC and MNC, is a limited resource. So it became apparent that in the thought process that if an HNI was assigned to each one, we'd run out of HNIs or mobile country codes rather quickly. So it's a limited resource. So one of the things to do as having oversight and administrative responsibility is to make sure that resource life is extended so you don't exhaust the resource. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the groups that I've been talking about, the ATIS, the IOC, the CBRS Alliance, and the IMSI Administrator collaborated on developing really a new set of guidelines. And the new set of guidelines are for something that was not established before, and we called it a shared HNI. So within the CBRS spectrum, or the set of services, there is an HNI. And one of the things that was established was we created another component within the MSIN called an IBM to be allocated. So again, the single shared HNI is to the CBRS spectrum operators. But within that, within the shared HNI, there was a new IMSI block number that was created out of the MSIN that allows for 10,000 assignments per shared HNI. So each IBN is provided 100,000 IMSIs. And of course, that was negotiated and agreed to by all the parties. So again, if you remember the components, it's the MCC, MNC, which is the HNI or the PLMID, is shared amongst all the operators, but each CBRS operator who applies for a set of resources would get an IBN. And that is unique to that individual applicant. And then that applicant would then have the management, oversight, maintenance responsibility for the 100,000 IMSIs, and they can assign them to their subscribers. And the other part was the IMSI Administrator, which is iConnective, would continue to manage these new IBN assignments. So if you go to the next slide. So just to create a picture, I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. Again, this is the format of an IMSI, and this represents the components for the CBRS Alliance that the IOC agreed to. So if you see in green, I'll start on the left, the mobile country code is assigned by the ITU, and in red, where they have the mobile network code, ATIS and the IMSI Administrator maintain in the U.S., and that's primarily for non-CBRS operators. Now, what we created and the new set of guidelines needed to be established because this new IMSI block number as part of the guidelines was established, and it has its own set of criteria and process for applying for a resource. So that's in basically orange. and it's the ATIS and IMSI administrator maintained in the U.S. Now again, if I go to the right of that orange block, there is something called a user identification number, which is assigned by each of the spectrum operators. So if you look in total, and if you remember E212, the mobile country code and mobile network code remain the same. And what we didn't change the length of the MSIN. We just subdivided that into two components, the IMSI block number and the user identification number. So the systems, the network equipment that know how to recognize and operate these things, we didn't want to fundamentally change the format or how things are done. So that's why we made the decisions we made. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, I think that's my summary slide. So at the end, the IMSI Oversight Council approved a new set of guidelines, the IMSI Assignment and Management for the Shared HNI for the CBRS range. On this chart, there's a website, there's an ATIS website where you can go and get these new approved guidelines. Within these guidelines, there are also forms, application forms for an applicant to submit, and it goes through the entire process. So please, if you're interested in applying or understanding a little bit more about this, please go to the ATIS website and you can look at the assignment guidelines. So the other thing that I mentioned, the IOC agreed, one of the things, who was going to be the IBN administrator, that the IMSI administrator would continue to administer these new resources. Now, one of the things that came into some of the additional considerations is in setting aside these guidelines, it was specified, and one of the criteria that's different from any other HNI assignment is that the applicant needs to have an agreement in place with an SAS, or Spectrum Allocation Server. So that's one of the additional criteria that's not in place for anything else and is particular just to the CBRS range. In addition, it should be noted that there are public operators today that want to extend services in the CBSR range, and they can use their existing HNI resources to do that. So just because you're offering services in this range, it doesn't mean that you have to assign for an IBN specifically. You may be a public operator that has existing resources already. You can utilize those E212 resources for that. Now, one of the other things also that the IOC recognized and acknowledged is that there could be other users of technology or spectrum that would make similar inquiries of an HNI or a shared HNI. And one of the things that the IOC wants to be able to do is evaluate each on its own set of use cases, criteria, and recommendations. So it's possible that we have now two sets of guidelines, one for the MCC, MNC, or HNI, or PLMNID, or for the CBRS spectrum. But there could be other spectrum that the FCC allocates. It could have a different set of criteria, in which case the IOC is open for those users of that spectrum to come and potentially ask for, resources, in which case obviously the case would be reviewed, but if it was determined that a new set of guidelines needed to be developed, that would happen. Because I think one of the things that from an ATIS and iConnector perspective is that, we're, looking at and being advocates for the implementation of new services. So it doesn't mean that you're going to say yes every time, but one of the things is at least to assess and evaluate these different options or requests as they become available. So with that, that ends my formal part of the presentation. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I think that questions will be held to the end. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Al Jetty, who's going to take you through the rest of the presentation. Al?
Okay, thank you, Gary. Hopefully people can hear me. Gary, if you can confirm that, it'd be good.
I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. So anyways, thanks, Gary. A brief introduction for myself here. I chair the CBRS Alliance Technical Work Group. I'm also involved with the WIN Forum, which is kind of a sister organization. I've been involved working with the ATIS IOC with Gary and a number of other colleagues, and I head up Nokia's CBRS standards work in the US with nearly 30 years of telecom experience. Okay, so here, as noted by Gary already, the HNI, it's required for use in an LTE network. So that way you can know who the operator is. Is it your home network? Are you roaming, etc.? Myself and other members of the Alliance began discussions with the IMSI administrator and ATIS about how new CBRS operators could acquire an HNI. And Gary's already noted that there were a number of issues, including one is we're using shared spectrum, which is outside the current rules, sort of. There's a limited number of HNIs, and it would pose a problem. As he said, there's about 700 roughly of the 2-digit ones, which are mostly needed, or if you want, you can count them 3 digits, but really the last digit is 0. And various CBRS use cases would violate the existing HNI rules. So we worked with the ATIS IMSI Oversight Council and the IMSI administrator, and we came up with this shared HNI concept. Okay, where new operators would get a block of IMSIs. So I'd like to emphasize that the CBRS shared HNI is not needed by the major operators today who currently have or who could acquire their own HNI. So if you think and you can go and acquire an HNI, that's great. If it's your own independent HNI, I think you're better off if you can do that. But again, I think there's going to be limitations with using the CBRS spectrum, as Gary's already noted. So this is just for operators who don't have their own and who would go and acquire the shared one. I also want to apologize. I'm kind of realizing as Gary went through and I'm kind of looking at my slides that there's a ton of acronyms. So hopefully you can bear with us, and I'll try to do my best to kind of try to explain what's going on. So anyways, back to the slide here. Using a shared HNI does present a number of problems here. Okay, and if a non-unique HNI is used, we need some other manner to identify the network. And other LT networks include using the HNI. So there's certain other identifiers that use the HNI so that these other identifiers can be unique. Well, since it's shared, now these other, so if a major operator said, I'm going to use the HNI and then I'm going to assign maybe my cell IDs off of that, they could assign this as cell ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, now, unfortunately, with a shared HNI, if each new operator goes and assigns cell IDs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now we have a problem and a conflict there. So we need to address these other identifiers that would use the shared HNI and what we could do to make sure that they are unique and independent. Okay, I think that covers the main point on this slide. So if we could move ahead here. Okay, thank you very much. Here, this is just a basic LTE within a field called SIB1, which is System Information Block 1. And this, within here, this is broadcast by the LTE node B. So every LTE node B goes and broadcasts, here's System Info Block 1 periodically. It's configurable how often it broadcasts it, but it broadcasts it and the devices read SIB1. And typically, the device is going to read SIB1 and then take a look at the PLMN ID and determine if it's their home network or an approved roaming partner. So within SIB1, there could be multiple PLMN IDs. A lot of the major network operators would have multiple PLMN IDs, and that's because of different consolidation in the industry for one reason. So if major operator 1 buys some smaller operator 2, now they have multiple PLMN IDs. So you've got that, plus you have multiple multi-operator core networks, MOCN, where you could have multiple PLMN IDs entered into SIB1. This is all configured by the operator. And again, as I noted, the device is going to read SIB1. It's going to take a look and say, oh, is this my home network or some approved roaming partner? Yes, it is. Now I can start to attach to that network. Okay. So again, this is nothing to do with the CBRS HNI at this point in time. This is just generic the way LTE works. So if we could flip to the next slide. Okay. So here on the next slide, it goes through, and at the bottom, I'm going to start there, and this is drilling down to the next level. This is taken from a 3GPP spec, for those of you familiar with it. This is kind of shows what's in System Information Block 1. You can see I highlighted the PLMN identity list, and this is just the HNIs. Again, as Gary had mentioned, PLMN stands for Public Land Mobile Network Identity. It's also, again, known as Home Network Identifier. So same basic thing. So it's going to have a list of, here's my PLMN IDs. And then what we have done is, again, because we've got a shared HNI or PLMN ID, we now decided that we would use this CSG indicator, which is Closed Subscriber Group Identifier. And within there, that's how we're going to uniquely identify who the operator is. So I'm going to just use like Mall of America for an example. Perhaps Mall of America had wanted to deploy a CBRS network. So what they would do is they would get a CSG identity, and they would go and apply to the alliance to acquire one. And then we would uniquely assign these CSG identities so that we could ensure that each of the operators was unique, so that the devices, as they went and started reading SIB1, they would then know if this was their home network and they were allowed to attach. Okay, let me see here. In the diagram at the bottom too, I also highlight cell identity. I'm going to get to that in a future slide coming up, but I just wanted to highlight that was also within SIB1. Okay, so the bullets here, CBRS Alliance will use the CSG ID to uniquely identify the network. So we're kind of repurposing this, and it's transmitted as the 3GPP CSG identity in SIB1, and it's broadcast to all users. Okay, if we could get to the next slide. Okay. Here, this kind of shows, again, similar to the prior slide. So the eNode B is going to broadcast SIB1, and you're going to see the PLMN IDs. And for us now, you're going to see the CBRS shared PLMN ID. And then you're going to have to read the CSG identity field with the CBRS NID. And then the device is going to read this, and then it's going to say, oh, yeah, this is my network, perhaps Mall of America. So now I know I can attach to it. I'd also like to point out that we're leveraging a lot of these concepts from another industry group called Multifire, for those of you who are familiar with it. Multifire is another global group, and they're a global forum, and they were focused on standardizing use of LTE within unlicensed bands like the Wi-Fi band. So if you were going to use the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi band, they could now use that for LTE. And again, they would then use this CSG identity field to uniquely identify the network. So we're very thankful for the experts from Multifire who helped out and came up with workable solutions to these problems that we're now leveraging. Okay. If we could flip to the next slide here, Caitlin. That was okay. Mine is a little slower updating here. Okay. Here, the HNI, as I previously mentioned, is also part of various other LTE identifiers. And as what Gary had previously noted, it's used within the IMSI, and the HNI is the first 6 digits within the IMSI. And the remaining 9 digits would uniquely identify the device. So, an operator, a major operator, they'd use their HNI, and then if you had a SIM card, your IMSI, the first 6 digits, as you noted, would be your PLMN ID or HNI, and then the remaining 9 digits would uniquely identify the device. There's also a few other identifiers that do leverage the HNI, as we've mentioned. And one of them is called the Globally Unique MME Identifier. The MME, it's a main signaling node within an LTE evolved packet core, and it's used to route messages within the EU-TRAN network. And the GUMI, Globally Unique MME Identifier, it uniquely identifies the MME. So that for whether you're roaming or you're just, messaging to the MME, you need to have this GUMI to say, oh, here's my, globally unique MME that I'm communicating with. Another identifier that does use the HNI is the cell ID or EU cell ID, ECGI. And this is to uniquely identify a cell. And this needs to be unique for a number of things like location, and it's used within E911 so that your device can then, know, hey, here's my cell ID, and then there's services that would then look up and say, oh, I see roughly where you're located. So we need to do something here, again, with the cell ID, because, again, we don't want Mall of America's cell ID to conflict with, some Las Vegas casino that might have a CBRS network. And another item that uses the HNI is the tracking area identifier. Okay, and this is also helpful to uniquely identify what tracking area you're in, so that if the network needs to page you, okay, they'll know which cells to send the page message to, so that you can then get it and then respond and say, oh, here I am, please, route my call accordingly. There is a couple other minor things. I think there's one that's just more of a flag saying I use this, and then there's some other stuff, and it's related to neutral host networking. I felt as though the presentation had enough acronyms and enough content, so that I felt like it was best to just omit neutral host networking identifiers. There's really one that says it's a flag if there is neutral host networks, and then there's another one that identifies which networks they are. And for those who want to dig in a little bit deeper, we're leveraging some of the Wi-Fi network information for CBRS neutral host networks. Okay. I also want to note, and I can bring it up here, this is fine, that for those of you who want to dig in deeper, within the Alliance, we're pretty much finishing up a document on these identifiers, and it should be published shortly and available to the public. It went through ballot, and right now we're just finishing off a few minor editorial cleanups. And I suspect over the next couple of weeks, it should be published for those of you who want to go and download the document. It's got a lot more information. Again, this is a webinar, and we're just trying to give you some of the highlights. Okay. Next here, we've got the GUMI. Okay. Again, usually operators would assign their own MME IDs. If you look at the diagram on the bottom, you get the GUMI, and the GUMI is composed of your HNI, and in our case, it's a shared CBRS HNI, and it includes this MME ID. Okay, so usually operators, again, a major operator would assign their own MMEIs, and it would be unique. So Verizon's would be different from AT&T's or Sprint's or T-Mobile's, because they would have their own unique HNI, and then they would make sure that their MMEIs were unique. Again, we don't quite have that luxury. So what we have done is we've taken and segmented the MME ID into 2 parts. One is an MME group ID, and that's going to be assigned by the Alliance to make sure that it is unique, so that 2 CBRS operators would have unique MMEGIs And again, the HNI is going to be different for, a Mall of America than it would be for a T-Mobile or Sprint or whoever the major operator is. And we do allow a couple of extra digits there for the MME code, so that if you were, again, I'm using Mall of America as my example here, if you were Mall of America and wanted to deploy a CBRS network, you could have a few different MMEs in your network, so that you would then be able to ensure that your gummies are unique. Okay. Okay, I think that's all I really had on this slide. If we could move forward. Okay, uniquely identifying the cell. Again, this is very similar to what the gummy is. And the EUTRA cell global identifier, again, if you look at the bottom, it includes the HNI, and in our case, again, it's shared. So we needed to make sure that the cell identities were unique. So within the Alliance, again, we're going to be assigning macro eNode BIDs, and you can apply and get, if you have 1,000 or more, 10,000, you can apply and get multiple eNode BIDs for your network. And within there, the operator itself, again, using Mall of America, could then assign a cell number. Cell number would be used perhaps if you've got a 3 to 6 sector cell, or if you had remote radio heads, each radio head would get a unique cell number. So there's different situations where you could use different cell numbers for the same eNode B. Okay. As I've noted previously, your ECGI is used by various applications, including, E911, positioning, billing, RF measurements, and thus it's very important that this is unique for your LTE network. Okay. That's what I had for that slide. If we could move on. Tracking area identity and tracking area codes. This is the final, hopefully the final acronym I'm going to throw at you today, or identifier. And again, you can look at the bottom and you can see that this includes the HNI. It's the CBRSI, but that's the CBRSI is just another acronym that we're using for the CBRS shared HNI. So it includes the MCC and the MNC. So again, we then came up with a way to define different tracking area codes. And here we're going to base it on your IMSI block number that Gary talked about earlier. So when you get an IMSI block number, we will use that to give you multiple tracking area codes that you can then use in your network. And as I said, the tracking area codes used for, paging a device and keeping track of where the device is located. Okay, I think that's what I had for this slide. If we could move ahead. Okay, this slide really is more of a summary of identifiers that we presented today. And as I noted, there's a lot more information on a really good document that a colleague of mine, David Crow, who's on the call, he actually has been editor and done a great job at drafting the document and putting it together. But I felt like this was just a good summary slide so that you could take a look at the different identifiers. You could see how they're used. So, again, the CBRS shared HNI, it's used in SIV1 to identify the network. Your IBN is part of your IMSI. Your UIN is part of your IMSI. Your NID is used for the network identifier, and it's used within SIV1. We've talked about the MMEGI, which is part of the gummy, and the macro eNode BID, which is part of your ECGI. Who assigns it, who it's assigned to, and some basic notes about it. And like for macro eNode BIDs, I touched on that. There's 2 to the 20th different unique macro eNode IDs. So you've got roughly 1 million of them that we can assign. And then each of those could yield up to 256 unique radio heads or sectors or whatever. But it's just hopefully a good reference for those of you who are interested and want a little bit more of a quick summary. If we could flip to the next slide. Okay, this gets into routing of diameter messages, and this would be something that we might consider for a future webinar, because it does get in a little bit more depth. But again, so to uniquely identify your CBRS network, if you're roaming or you've got an inbound call, usually what would happen is I would call someone else. Perhaps I would call Gary Richnecker. And if I'm on one network and he's on another network and I'm calling him, it needs to then say, oh, how do I route my call to Gary? And it's going to take a look and say, oh, I see this is going to a home network identifier that belongs to, I'll use US Cellular just to use a different one for now. And then it would take a look and say, oh, I know how to route that call to US Cellular, and it would route it accordingly. Within again, using a shared HNI, okay, you can't just look at that and say, oh, this goes to Mall of America. All you would know is, oh, this is going to some shared CBRS network operator. So what we need to do is we need to use this IMSI block number table, and that's going to then uniquely identify the network that I'm calling. So again, if I'm calling to a user who's a shared CBRS user, a network, and again using Mall of America, it would need to look up, say, oh, I know it's a shared CBRS network, but which one is it? And then it would access this IBN table to then know, oh, this is going to Mall of America, and it would route it then accordingly. And as we noted earlier, there could be thousands, or we expect there's going to be thousands of these shared CBRS network operators. So we needed some new way to do the routing. And I've worked a bit with some colleagues from Ericsson who've really helped out to, get this going and work out some of the concepts. And if we flip to the next slide, this is, again, more of a summary slide. And so if you are some new operator, and again, I'm going to use Mall of America, you would, along the top, the green boxes would be what you would work with the, what you would apply and work with the IMSI administrator or iConnected. You have to apply for a CBRS shared IBN. And also they would say, yeah, you can use the shared CBRS HNI, and here's an IBN. You can use that IBN to then, program your SIM cards within your devices, and that would take care of the green along the top. Now, along the bottom in the blue boxes would be what you would do with the CBRS Alliance. You could apply for LTE network identifiers from the CBRS Alliance. This includes, again, your NID, your MME group IDs, and your macro eNode B IDs. And then you could start assigning IMSIs or program your SIM cards, tracking area codes, MME codes, cell IDs, tracking areas, etc. And these are all your identifiers that you need to set up and deploy an LTE network. On the bottom there, I've got some contacts. There's a web link here for the IMSI administrator to apply for getting a shared IBN. I know that on their website there's you've got listed one, but I know there's more than one. I think that the website's just a little bit out of date.
Al, this is Gary Richnecker. It's been updated.
Oh, okay, great. So, there's at least a few of them who so far have applied. Again, this is fairly new, and none of these systems are yet commercial. They're still in trial, but we expect in early 2019 we're going to start going commercial. So we expect there's going to be a flood of more applicants over the next 3 to 6 months. And you can also contact the CBRS Alliance to start acquiring network IDs and these other identifiers. I'm going to tell you, within the Alliance, we're still working out some of the details and getting set up to support these. So it's still at a very early phase. But hopefully by, let's say, January 1st or sooner, we should get this well in place. So again, it's new. We're still working out some of the details. And, you know, we should be able to support you shortly. So if we can flip to the next slide. I'm near the end, and I know there's been a ton of questions that have gone in there. So if you just bear with us a few minutes, we'll be able to start getting to some of the questions. Is my screen not updating, Caitlin? I'm not seeing you flip yet to the next slide. Oh, it went away. Okay. Again, this next slide is just acknowledgements and some additional information and links. I'd like to thank a number of people who helped with this presentation. They've provided either content or reviewed, and it's just been really a group effort, and I'd like to thank a number of people. I'm noting in there, I'm not going to go through reading it. And again, for additional information on the CBRS Alliance or how to join the Alliance or how to get onto mailing lists, please contact the email link there. I also want to give a plug for ATIS. They have a lot of really great groups, organizations. I've been involved with ATIS for many years now. We work with them with the IMSI Oversight Committee. But they also have committees that are involved in addressing things like E911 or lawful intercept or a number of other regulatory features and supporting 3GPP within being a supporting member for 3GPP as an SDO. And for that, I would just refer you to the ATIS website. But there's a lot of great people and great information that ATIS has. I want to make sure that we recognize them here too. So, okay, and I think the next slide, it just opens it up for questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Very good. Thank you, Al. Thank you, Gary. Excellent presentations. As Al mentioned just a moment ago, we've gotten lots of questions. I don't know if we'll have enough time to get through many of them, but we will try. So the first one I'd like to tee up for both of you, Al and Gary, is around SaaS providers and SaaS requirements. The question from Nanda Manan is the current application forms require submission of a SaaS contract with the application. SaaS contract is usually with the radio vendor and not, for example, with the enterprise who's running the network. How should the application be done in this case? And maybe just some additional thoughts around the agreement with the SaaS provider.
Gary, did we make that as part of the application, or was that some confirmation that you had to provide later? I thought that was a second phase where after you deployed, you had to then show that, but refresh my memory.
Yes. Yeah, the way it was envisioned, let me put it that way, was that as part of deployment, that there needed to be some type of arrangement with an SAS in order to deploy service. So one of the criteria was we wanted to establish that relationship with the applicant, with the SAS. Now, having, I think, been with some experience, it's sometimes not a direct relationship, but I think that what would be required would be some sort of indication that there's a relationship, whether it's through another provider to the SAS. So one of the things as an administrator, we just don't want to, assign these without meeting some of the criteria. And having it been brand new, one of the other things we're looking at is, do we need to change or update the guidelines to accommodate some of these maybe unique situations or situations which we haven't faced before? So, hopefully there's an understanding, with the industry as we work through this. We were doing this for the first time. There may be situations where it doesn't actually conform to the guidelines, and we'll certainly work with the applicants to, to educate them and see what we need. Is that helpful?
Yeah, let me add to that, and I think that was a good answer, Gary. But as Gary had noted, these IMSIs and mobile network codes are a limited government resource, and they wanted to not only make sure that they wanted to really make sure that you were seriously going to do this. Excuse me, if they made it so that it was real easy, there might be a lot of people applying and getting these resources and then deciding, no, I'm not going to use it. So this was sort of a way to say, are you seriously going to deploy? And, and then there was a second step to confirm that you deployed. And if not, then you would forfeit your IBN. But you had something like, I think it was 18 months after receiving your IBN to then come back and say, see, I've deployed, and verify it. So, but hopefully that helps. Okay. Alan?
Thanks. Yep. So the next question teed up for you guys is, and I think partially just because the name given here is Santa Claus, I feel like I have to give you guys a gift. If shared HNI is everywhere, do you anticipate CSG option being available so my network can reject non-members?
Let me see. I want to see that question myself. HNI is everywhere. You anticipate close subscriber group, so my network can reject non-members. So I'm not quite sure I fully digest the question, but so if you've got shared HNI everywhere, again, let's just use Mall of America, but I mean, you could have, malls all over the country. And then you would use your CSG, your closed subscriber group, to then indicate your network identifier. So, your NID then would say, I'm Mall of America, and, when a user would attempt to attach, you would then look at their IMSI and say, oh, is this, part of my network or not? And you would be able to reject or accept it. So it's really a special use of the CSG identifier from LTE. I hope that answers the question. Either that or maybe I'm misunderstanding it.
I think a good stab at it, Al. So if anybody needs clarification, of course, we can do some follow-up later. But I'm going to move on to another question from Peter Tenerelli. Does this mechanism also somehow enable infrastructure sharing similar to the way multi-operator core network, MOCN, does?
Yes, you would be able to put in your different PLMN IDs. Just one of them would be the CBRS shared HNI, which would be 315-010. And I'm pretty sure that you would also be able to put in other MOCN network PLMN IDs within there. So I'm pretty sure that would be the way it would work. So.
Okay. Working back here to another question for you guys. Who will provide diameter routing based on the 4-digit of the CBRS operator within the CBRS HNI? How will roaming agreements work between CBRS operators and public operators?
That's a great question, and that's one that is still being discussed within the board of directors about a diameter routing server and getting that launched and set up. So I think that's kind of a future phase that we're looking at. And as I noted, that could be even a future webinar. So if there's a strong interest, in such a webinar, if people could put into the chat, and we'll take a look. And my guess is it'd probably be maybe 6 months away before we'd be ready to launch such a webinar.
Good. Yeah, as you
Yeah,
mentioned,
if I
Al,
could,
a lot of work still to do. Please, Gary,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, this was to the roaming aspect, I think. One of the things that it was acknowledged and, stated in the beginning that the CBRS codes or the operators didn't have to enable like roaming, or if they did, it would be later. So when I want to get to the roaming, I would assume that in these particular networks, that in the original deployment, there probably wouldn't be roaming between these operators and public operators. And of course, if they did want to have roaming, then you have to establish, these interconnect agreements, these roaming agreements, and that usually entails a lot of work. Now, you may have associations with an existing partner already, which would make it a little bit easier, but it's something that would need to be worked out between the CBRS operators, network operators, on if they wanted to enable roaming on their particular network or out of their network.
Good. Thanks, Gary, for the additional clarification on that. Another question, this time from Shingao. Is IBN unique for each operator?
Yeah, that would be unique. You would need to apply, as we said, to the IMSI administrator, and you would apply and get one, or if you had a lot of IMSIs that you needed to support, you would apply and get a second batch of IBNs. But that would be unique per operator.
And very good, thanks. Another clarification, I think we've been kind of hitting on this, but always good to revisit, is are CBS service providers required to obtain IMSIs or the hardware vendors?
Well, Al, I would say that it's not the hardware vendors, it's actually the operators of the service. Now, they may deploy hardware, buy hardware, and obviously the hardware has to understand what it's, if I want to connect to the network or handshake, they have to understand that. But I think it's the operator's responsibility to apply for one.
Good, Gary. Here's one sort of up to you guys. What is the PLMN ID for the CBRS shared HNI? Is this already assigned?
Gary, I'll let you take that.
Yes, it is, and it's on the website. And forgive me if I don't have it memorized, but it has been assigned.
It's, by the way, it's 315-010.
And another question: what level of CBRS Alliance membership is required for the HNI sharing? Is adopter okay?
Alan, I think that's one for you.
Yeah, I was wondering if that would bounce back to me, Al. So, yeah, we're determining that membership is not necessarily required to utilize this. Of course, you have a voice when you are a member, but and if anyone is interested in becoming a member, please contact admin@cbrsalliance.org. If you'd like to discuss any of those aspects, I'd be happy to set up a call with you or route you to the right folks to make sure we get some good answers. Good deal. Well, we are rapidly coming up on our hour. I don't know if there's another quick question. Maybe try to serve up one more for you guys. We can find a short one here. Can we assign NANPA numbers to SHNI, shared HNI IMSIs?
Could you repeat that? When you say no, you mean like telephone numbers?
Yeah, I believe it's specifically, can we assign NANPA numbers to shared HNI IMSIs?
Well, I guess the official administrative response is only if you've been assigned them,
right,
or have have direct responsibility for them. You just can't randomly assign NAMP numbers to the IMSIs, just
Right.
because you want to. You have to, be eligible to do that.
Well, very good. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We are now coming up officially on our hour, and we will be closing the webinar. I know there are several questions we didn't get to, but we'll be happy to, catch any of those. Feel free to contact us at admin@cbrsalliance.org. And if you'd like to discuss membership or any of those specific topics, I'll be happy to work with you, Alan Ewing, Executive Director, with you to get answers to additional questions. With that, we will go ahead and close the session. Everybody, thank you. Gary and Al, excellent job. Very much appreciate your time and effort on this.